It's about a woman from back east, with a mind full of science and a heart full of hope, who found herself face to face with the raw, tooth and claw soul of this land. It's a story of how everything can be lost in a heartbeat, and how sometimes, when you're left with nothing, you find the one thing you were truly looking for. It's a tale of survival, of an unlikely friendship, and of a quiet warrior who listened to the whispers of the river. The prairie was an ocean of grass, and Elspeth Vance's wagon was a solitary, lumbering ship upon its waves. For weeks, the view from her seat had been a hypnotic, rolling expanse of green and gold under a sky so vast it seemed to press down on the very edges of the world. She had left behind the staid, gaslight world of Philadelphia, a world of corsets, polite society, and suffocating expectations, to chase a dream as wide as this sky, to be the first woman to properly catalog and illustrate the unique flora of the Dakota Territory's Black Hills. In her lap, a leather-bound journal was open, its pages filled with elegant, precise pencil sketches of the plants she had encountered along the trail: the prairie crocus, the blue grama grass, the intricate, star-like bloom of a wild onion. She was a scientist at heart, trained by her late father, a respected botanist who had encouraged her talent in a time when most men would have simply encouraged her to find a suitable husband. The journey was an homage to him, a fulfillment of a shared dream. She was not, however, a fool. She knew the dangers. She had hired two men in Omaha, a grizzled, taciturn wagon master named Silas, and his younger, talkative companion, a boy named Finn. They were rough men, but they seemed capable, and her funds, carefully saved from the sale of her family's home, were not unlimited. Should be back in the Cheyenne River by sundown tomorrow, Miss Vance. Finn called back from his position riding point, his voice cheerful. Then it's just a few more days till we see the paw-sop of the Black Hills. Thank you, Finn, she called back, her voice clear and educated, a sound as out of place here as a porcelain teacup on a branding fire. She looked at Silas, who was handling the reins of the mule team. He just grunted, his eyes shaded by the brim of a filthy hat, constantly scanning the horizon. He was a man who seemed to have a deep and abiding mistrust of open spaces, a strange quality in a wagon master. There was a coiled tension in him she couldn't quite place, a darkness in his eyes that had nothing to do with the shadows of his hat. That evening, as they made camp, the feeling of unease that had been a small, persistent whisper in the back of Elspeth's mind grew louder. Silas was quiet, but his silence was different tonight. It was watchful, predatory. Finn, usually so full of stories and jokes, was subdued, casting nervous glances at his partner. Best be turning in, Miss Vance, Silas said, his voice a low gravelly sound. He was staring into the flames of the campfire, but his eyes weren't seeing them. Long day tomorrow. Elspeth retreated to the small space cleared for her at the back of the wagon. She clutched the small, silver-plated derringer her father had insisted she take. She had never fired a gun in her life, and its weight was a cold and familiar burden. She lay in her bedroll, the sounds of the prairie chirp of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, usually a comfort, now seeming to hold a note of warning. She eventually drifted into a restless sleep. The last thing she saw the silhouette of Silas, standing a lonely, dark vigil against the star-dusted sky. The world exploded into chaos just before dawn. It wasn't an attack from outside. It was a betrayal from within. She was jolted awake by a scream cut short with a sickening, wet thud. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the pale, pre-dawn light, she saw Silas standing over Finn's still body, a bloody skinning knife in his hand. Before she could even scream, Silas was at the back of the wagon, his face a terrifying mask of greed. Shouldn't have brought a boy to do a man's work, he snarled, more to himself than to her. He lunged for the small, locked strongbox under her cot, the one that held the remainder of her funds. But Silas wasn't alone. 3 other figures emerged from the darkness, rough, hard-faced men who had clearly been waiting for his signal. They were bandits, and her own wagon master had led them straight to her. "Get the cash, Silas," one of them shouted. "We ain't got all day." Elspeth reacted on pure, terrified instinct. She scrambled for the derringer, her fingers fumbling with the clasp of her bag. She raised the small pistol, its barrel trembling in her hand, and pointed it at Silas. He just laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "You ain't got the sand, little lady." He was wrong. She squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, the recoil much stronger than she'd expected. The shot went wild, tearing a hole in the canvas cover of the wagon, but it was enough. Silas staggered back, a look of shocked surprise on his face. The other men, however, were not surprised. They were furious. One of them, a hulking brute with a vacant expression, grabbed her, his hand clamping over her mouth, his other arm a band of iron around her waist. She was helpless. They tore the strongbox from the wagon. They took her father's scientific instruments, her spare clothes, her food supplies. They took everything of value, their movements practiced and brutally efficient. In less than 5 minutes, they had stripped her life bare. "What about her?" the brute holding her asked, his voice a low rumble. Silas, his face a mask of rage, wiped a trickle of blood from his ear where the Derringer's bullet had grazed him. "She's not worth the bullet." He looked at the mules, then at the steep, rocky embankment that led down to a dry creek bed beside their camp. "Cut him loose," he ordered. One of the men sliced through the mule's traces. Another fired his pistol into the air. The terrified animals bolted, dragging the heavy and guided wagon with them. It careened wildly for a moment, then pitched over the side of the embankment, crashing down into the rocky creek bed with a bone-jarring, splintering roar of destruction. Elspeth, still held in the outlaw's grip, watched it happen. The last thing she saw before the world went black was her precious journal, filled with her father's legacy and her own dreams, flying from the wreckage and landing in the dust. The bandits, assuming her dead or dying in the crash, mounted their horses and rode off, their laughter a final, cruel epitaph to her hopes. They didn't even bother to check. They just abandoned her, a broken woman beside a broken wagon, in the heart of a vast, indifferent wilderness. Miles away, in a place where the prairie began to give way to the rugged, pine-studded foothills of the Black Hills, a man named Chayton sat by a small, smokeless fire. The name meant falcon in the language of his people, the Dakota, and it was a name he had earned. His eyes, dark and sharp, seemed to see not just the world, but the stories the world left behind. He saw the way a blade of grass was bent, the way a stone was scuffed, and from these small, silent clues, he could read the tale of who had passed and why. He was a man caught between two worlds. He wore the buckskin leggings and soft moccasins of his ancestors, but over them, a worn linen shirt and a battered hat he had gotten from a white trader. His long, black hair was tied back with a leather thong, his face a proud, stoic mask of high cheekbones and a strong jaw. He carried a modern Winchester rifle, but also a long-bladed knife his grandfather had made, its handle wrapped in sacred beadwork. He was a scout, a tracker, sometimes for the army, sometimes for himself, a man who navigated the treacherous landscape between the old ways and the new. He was not hunting deer this day. He was hunting men. 3 days ago, a small, independent trading post run by an old friend of his, a French-Canadian named Dubois, had been hit. Dubois and his wife were killed, their post burned to the ground. The soldiers from the nearest fort had ridden out, found a few confused tracks, and declared the trail cold, blaming it on a nameless band of hostiles. Chayton knew better. He had gone to the ruins himself and had read the real story in the ashes and the dust. He found the tracks of shod horses, not the unshod ponies of a traditional raiding party. He found a single, drop casing from a store-bought cartridge, not the reloaded shells his own people often used. And he found a boot print with a distinctive, worn-down heel. These were white men, trying to make their crime look like the work of Indians. The insult was a hot coal in his gut. Dubois had been a good man, a man who had treated the Dakota with fairness and respect. His death demanded justice. So Chayton had taken up the trail. For 2 days, he had followed them, a patient, relentless shadow. He was the falcon, and he was circling his prey. He knew they were heading southeast, towards the more open country, likely looking for a new, softer target. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the plains, he found where they had met their fifth man. He saw the tracks of a heavy wagon, the signs of a camp. He dismounted, his moccasins making no sound on the dry earth. He knelt and examined the ashes of the campfire, still faintly warm. They were close. He found the body of the boy, thin, half hidden in the tall grass. The boy was young, his face frozen in a mask of surprise and betrayal. Chayton closed the boy's staring eyes, a flicker of something cold and hard in his own. These men were not just thieves, they were killers who preyed on their own kind. Then he saw the signs of the wagon. The deep ruts in the earth, the sudden, violent swerve towards the embankment. He followed them to the edge and looked down. The sight of the wreckage, a splintered chaos of wood and canvas in the dry creek bed, told a clear story. He made his way down the steep incline, his movements as fluid and sure-footed as a mountain goat. He circled the wreckage, his eyes missing nothing. He saw the signs of the looting, the discarded, worthless items. He saw the single bullet hole in the canvas. And he saw the small, silver derringer lying in the dust. A woman's gun. He scanned the ground, his gaze sweeping in ever-widening circles. He saw the boot prints of the 4 men, and the single, distinctive print of the wagon master. He saw where they had mounted their horses and ridden away. He saw everything, and he assumed, as they had, that the woman who had fired the little pistol was buried somewhere in the splintered ruin of the wagon. He stood for a long moment, a silent, solitary figure in the vast, quiet landscape. His hunt for Du Bois's killers had led him here, to another tragedy, another layer of senseless violence. A cold, bitter anger settled in his heart. He was about to turn away, to take up the Outlaws' trail once more, when something caught his eye. A disturbance in the dust. It was not a footprint. It was a long, shallow drag mark, accompanied by the faint, scuffing impressions of a hand, and then another. It was the trail of someone crawling. Someone weak, injured, but alive. His eyes, sharp as a falcon's, followed the desperate, painful trail. It led away from the wagon, away from the scene of the attack, and pointed in one unwavering direction, towards the distant, shimmering line of green that marked the Cheyenne River. Hope, a feeling he had not expected to find here, flickered within him. He began to follow the trail, his pace quickening, a new, urgent purpose in his long strides. The story of this place was not yet over. There was a survivor, and the falcon was no longer just a hunter. He was now, perhaps, a rescuer. Pain was the first thing to return to Elspeth. It was a dull, throbbing concert performed by every muscle and bone in her body. The second was thirst. It was a dry, rasping thing, a fire in her throat that seemed to suck all the moisture from the world. She opened her eyes. The world was a blinding, vertical blur of brown rock and blue sky. She was lying at the bottom of the dry creek bed, her cheek pressed against the hot, rough stones. Memory returned in a brutal, chaotic flood. Silas's sneer, Finn's scream, the roar of the derringer, the sickening, splintering crash of the wagon. She pushed herself up, a groan of agony escaping her lips. Her left arm was a blaze of fire. It was bent at an unnatural angle just below the shoulder. Broken. Her head swam with a wave of dizziness, and the world tilted crazily. She was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. The bandits were gone. The wagon, her small, mobile piece of civilization, was a ruin, its contents scattered like the entrails of some great, dead beast. She saw her journal, its cover torn, its pages rifled by the wind, a few yards away. It was the only piece of her old life left. A wave of despair so profound it was almost a physical blow washed over her. She had been so sure, so confident in her purpose. Now, she was just another Eastern fool who had underestimated the sheer, brutal indifference of this land. She was going to die here. The thought was not a panicked one, but a calm, cold certainty. She would be another unmarked, and mourn grave in this vast, empty wilderness. But then, another thought, a stubborn, angry spark, ignited in the cold ashes of her despair. She thought of her father. He had faced down academic rivals, disease, the crushing weight of professional skepticism. He had never, ever given up. And she thought of Silas, of his cruel, dismissive laughter. She would not give him the satisfaction. She would not die. She began to move. It was a slow, agonizing process. She used her good arm to push herself, her legs to scrabble for purchase on the loose rock. Every movement sent a fresh wave of fire through her broken arm, and she had to stop every few feet, her vision graying out at the edges. She crawled to her journal and, with a clumsy, fumbling effort, tucked it into the front of her torn dress. It was an irrational act, to save a book when she should be saving herself, but it was a tether to who she was. She was not just a victim. She was Elspeth Vance, illustrator, botanist, her father's daughter. She needed water. The fire in her throat was an all-consuming obsession. She remembered Finn's words from the day before. The Cheyenne River by sundown tomorrow. The river was close. She didn't know which direction, but she could feel it. There was a subtle change in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible coolness, a whisper of life in the parched landscape. She chose a direction and began to crawl. Time lost all meaning. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer. The world became a small, focused circle of dust, rock, and pain. Her own ragged breathing was its only sound. Her mind began to drift, her thoughts a feverish jumble of memories and hallucinations. She saw her father in his study, smiling at her, his pipe smoke curling around his head. She saw the green, manicured lawns of Philadelphia. She saw Silas's face, laughing, always laughing. She crawled until her knees and her good hand were wry and bleeding. She crawled until she could no longer feel the pain, until she was moving on some deep, primal instinct that had taken over when her conscious mind had given up. She was an animal, driven by the single, overriding need for water. She smelled it before she saw it, the rich, loamy scent of damp earth and living things. She raised her head. Through a screen of cottonwood trees, she saw it, the river. It was not a mighty torrent, but a slow, wide, muddy ribbon of life, shimmering in the afternoon sun. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The sight of it gave her a final, impossible burst of strength. She stumbled, crawled, and half fell the last 100 yards, collapsing at the water's edge. She plunged her face into the cool, muddy water, drinking in great, desperate gulps. It was warm and tasted of silt, but it was life. The relief was so profound that it was overwhelming. The last of her strength drained away. Her body, having gotten her to her goal, simply shut down. She rolled onto her back, the wet mud a cool balm on her skin, her journal a hard lump against her chest. The world began to fade into a peaceful, welcoming darkness. Her last conscious thought was that the leaves of the cottonwood trees above her looked like 1,000 tiny, trembling green hearts. Chayton found her there. He had followed her tortuous trail from the wreckage, his initial flicker of hope turning into a grim admiration for her sheer, stubborn will to live. He stood over her for a long moment, a still, silent figure against the backdrop of the river. He saw the torn, expensive dress, now caked in mud and blood. He saw the soft, pale skin of her face, now scratched and sunburned. He saw the natural angle of her arm, and he saw the fierce and yielding set of her jaw, visible even in unconsciousness. This was not a weak woman. This was a woman who had clawed her way back from the edge of death itself. He knelt beside her, his movements economical and precise. He felt for the pulse in her neck. It was weak, thready, but it was there. She was alive. He looked around, his sharp eyes taking in the terrain. This was not a safe place. It was too open. The bandits could circle back. Or worse, a real war party from one of the more hostile Dakota bands might find them. He needed to get her to a place of safety. He needed to set her arm. He needed to find a way to keep this fragile, stubborn flame of a life from being extinguished. He gently, carefully, lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost frail. But he had seen the trail she had left. He knew that contained within this small, broken body was a spirit as strong and as unyielding as the ancient rocks of the Pahasapa. And as he carried her away from the river, towards a hidden, sheltered camp he knew of, he felt a strange, unfamiliar sense of responsibility settle over him. His hunt for justice had become something more. It had become a vigil. Elspeth awoke to the sensation of gentle, rhythmic pressure on her forehead. A cool, damp cloth was being pressed to her skin, smelling faintly of mint and damp earth. The world swam back into focus slowly, first as a blurry canopy of green leaves against a twilight sky, then as the flickering, orange dance of a small, well-contained fire. The pain in her arm was a sharp, localized fire, no longer the all-consuming inferno it had been. It was tightly bound in a splint made of smooth, straight branches and strips of soft leather. She turned her head, a sharp intake of breath a testament to her aching body. A man was kneeling beside her. In the firelight, his face was a study in sharp angles and deep shadows, his expression unreadable. His dark, intense eyes met hers. It was not the face of any of the bandits. This was someone new. A stranger. An Indian. Fear, cold and primal, gripped her. She tried to scramble away, her good hand pushing uselessly against the ground, a small, choked cry escaping her lips. The man didn't move. He simply raised a hand, palm open, in a gesture that was universally understood. A sign of peace. "Be still," he said. His voice was a low, quiet rumble, like distant thunder. His English was clear, with only a slight, musical cadence that marked it as a learned tongue. "You are safe. The wound is set. To move is to break it again." His calmness was a strange anchor in her sea of terror. She stopped struggling, her breathing ragged, her eyes wide and wary, never leaving his face. She was a scientist, a person who relied on observation and evidence, and the evidence before her was contradictory. Her experience told her that strangers in this wilderness were a threat. But this man's actions splint, the cool cloth, the safe fire spoke a different language. He seemed to understand her fear. He moved slowly, deliberately, never making a sudden gesture. He offered her a small, carved wooden cup. "Water," he said. "Drink." She hesitated. Her mind screamed at her not to trust him, but the thirst, still a powerful, grasping need, won out. She took the cup in her good hand, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was warm and calloused. She drank. The water was cool and clean, and she could taste the faint, pleasant flavor of the mint that had been in the cloth. They sat in silence for a long time after that, a silence that was filled with 1,000 unspoken questions. He seemed content to wait, to let her find her own footing in this new, terrifying reality. He tended the fire, his movements economical and graceful. Elspeth watched him, her analytical mind slowly beginning to reassert itself over the panic. He was a Dakota, she guessed from what she had read. A scout, judging by his lean, hard frame and the quiet, watchful way he held himself. He was alone. Where had he come from? Why had he helped her? He seemed to sense her questions. "My name is Chaitin," he said, looking at her across the small fire. "I was tracking the men who did this to you." The mention of the bandits sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. Are they coming back?" Chaitin shook his head. "No. They ride south. They think you are dead." He paused, his dark eyes seeming to look right through her. "They were wrong. You have a strong spirit." The simple, unadorned statement was more comforting than 100 flowery reassurances would have been. He wasn't pitying her. He was acknowledging her strength. He offered her food, a piece of smoked, dried meat jerky and a handful of wild berries he had gathered. It was tough and salty, and the berries were tart, but to Elspeth, who had not eaten in what felt like a lifetime, it was a feast. As she ate, a new, more practical fear began to settle in. What now? She was injured, helpless, completely dependent on this stranger. What did he want from her? "I must get to Fort Laramie," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "My father, he had friends there. An army surgeon. They will help me." Chaitin considered her words, his expression thoughtful. "Fort Laramie is a 10-day ride from here. You are in no condition to travel." "But I can't stay here," she insisted, a note of panic creeping into her voice. "Those men." "I am hunting them," Chaitin said, his voice flat, emotionless, but with an underlying current of cold, hard purpose that was more chilling than any threat. "For a friend they murdered. Our paths go the same way for a time." He was not offering to take her to the fort. He was stating a fact. He was going after the bandits, and she happened to be on the way. She was a complication, a burden he had found and now had to deal with. A new kind of resolve began to form in Elspeth. She would not be a burden. She would not be a helpless victim waiting to be rescued. "I can help," she said, the words surprising even herself. Chaitin looked at her, one eyebrow raised in a silent, skeptical question. "I can identify them," she explained, her mind working quickly. "I saw their faces. All of them. The leader, the one they called Silas. He had a scar on his ear, from my bullet. I can testify against them. I can describe them to the law." She was offering him the currency of her world information, testimony, the power of the white man's law. Chaitin was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the fire. He was weighing his options. To take her with him would be to slow him down, to endanger them both. To leave her here would be to leave her to die. His own code of honor, a thing far older than any written law, would not permit that. You will rest here for 2 days, he finally said. It was not a suggestion, it was a command. To let the fever in your arm break. Then we travel. We will follow their trail. We will see where it leads. It was not a promise of rescue. It was an alliance. A fragile and spoken pact made in the firelight, between two people from two different worlds, bound together by a shared tragedy and a common enemy. In the quiet of that hidden camp, as Elspeth finally succumbed to a deep, healing sleep, she realized that their communication had been sparse, their words few. But in the language of silence, in the shared space of a small, warm fire, a fragile, tentative trust had been born. The 2 days in the hidden camp by the river were a period of profound and painful transformation for Elspeth. The first day was a feverish blur of pain and disorientation. Chayton was a constant, quiet presence, changing the cool compress on her head, forcing her to drink a bitter, willow bark tea that brought down the fever, and checking the splint on her arm with a gentle, surprisingly practiced touch. He moved with a purpose and a quiet competence that she found both reassuring and deeply intimidating. He seemed to be a part of the landscape itself, as natural and as self-sufficient as the hawk that circled in the sky above. By the second day, the fever had broken, leaving her weak and drained, but clear-headed for the first time since the attack. The pain in her arm had subsided to a dull, manageable ache. It was then that her education truly began. Chayton was not a conversational teacher. He taught by doing, and he expected her to learn by watching. She saw how he moved, with a silence and an awareness that made her own previous movements seem clumsy and loud. She watched as he fashioned a fishing weir from stones in the river and caught two small, silvery fish, which he cooked over the coals on a green stick. She had never tasted anything so delicious. "You must learn," he said, as she watched him sharpen his knife on a smooth river stone. "This land does not forgive carelessness. It will feed you, or it will kill you. It is your choice." She was a botanist. She knew plants. She took her journal, which Chayton had retrieved for her, its pages stiff and warped from the damp, and began to sketch. She showed him a drawing of a plant with broad, arrow-shaped leaves. "Yarrow," he said, nodding in recognition. "Good for stopping bleeding." She pointed to another, a plant with small, purple flowers. "This one," she said, her voice still weak. "My father's book said the roots, when boiled, can soothe a cough. Is that true?" A flicker of something surprise, respect showed in his eyes. "It is true. You have knowledge." "I have book knowledge," she corrected him. "You have real knowledge." It was the first bridge they built between their two worlds. He began to point things out to her, showing her which berries were safe to eat, which roots could be dug and roasted for sustenance. He showed her how to identify the tracks of a deer, a coyote, a man. She, in turn, began to fill the blank pages of her damaged journal with new sketches, not just of plants, but of the animal tracks, of the way Chayton built his fire, of the intricate knot he used to secure their supplies. She was no longer just an illustrator of flora, she was becoming a student of survival. On the third morning, he deemed her fit to travel. He had spent the previous day working on a travois, two long poles hitched to his horse, with a deerskin sling between them. It was a crude but effective way to transport her without her having to ride. "The trail of the men you call bandits is 3 days old," he said, as he gently helped her onto the travois. "They are riding hard. We must move." The journey was slow and arduous. The rhythmic sway of the travois was a constant, jarring motion that sent waves of pain through her arm. But Elspeth did not complain. She bit her lip and focused on the landscape, on the lessons Chayton had begun to teach her. She began to see the world not as a picturesque scene to be captured on paper, but as a living, breathing entity, full of signs and portents. They found the bandits' first camp that evening. It was a mess. A carelessly built fire had scorched a patch of ground, and they had left behind empty bean cans and a discarded whiskey bottle. Chayton stood over the scene, his face a mask of contempt. "They are fools," he said, his voice a low growl. "They move with the noise of a herd of buffalo. They disrespect the land, and the land will be their enemy." He knelt and picked up the distinctive boot print with the worn heel. Silas. But a careless wolf is still a wolf. As they traveled, a quiet rhythm developed between them. Chayton would ride ahead, scouting the trail, while Elspeth followed on the travois, her eyes scanning the terrain, her mind absorbing every detail. In the evenings, they would make a small, hidden camp. He would hunt or fish, and she would help prepare the food with her one good hand, her knowledge of edible plants supplementing their meager diet. She began to see the man behind the stoic, silent facade. She saw the gentleness in the way he treated his horse, the flicker of humor in his eyes when she misidentified a bird call, the deep, abiding sadness that settled over him when he thought she wasn't looking. She learned that he had a wife and a daughter who had died of the white man's sickness, the spotted fever, years ago. She learned that the traitor, Du Bois, had been one of the few white men who had treated him as an equal, a friend. His hunt for these men was not just for justice, it was a way of honoring a memory, of trying to impose some small order on a world that had become chaotic and cruel. And he, in turn, began to see the woman behind the fragile, Eastern exterior. He saw her intelligence, her fierce determination, her refusal to be defined by her trauma. He saw the way her eyes lit up when she discovered a new flower, the way she would meticulously sketch it in her journal by the firelight, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was not like the other white women he had known, who seemed to him as delicate and as useless as hothouse flowers. She had a strength that was rooted in her mind and her spirit. They were two solitary, wounded souls, moving through a harsh and beautiful land. They rarely spoke of their pasts or of the future. They spoke of the trail, of the weather, of the signs the land gave them. But in the shared hardship of the journey, in the quiet companionship of the trail, they were beginning to heal. They were a team now, their individual strengths complementing each other. The botanist and the scout, the illustrator and the falcon. And they were getting closer, ever closer, to the trail of the vulture. 5 days into their journey, the character of the trail changed. They found the smoldering, grim remains of a burned-out way station, a small, lonely outpost that had served as a stop for the Deadwood stage. The station master and his wife had been killed. Chayton read the signs with a grim, practiced eye. It was Silas's work. The distinctive boot print was there, in the blood-soaked dust near the door. "They are getting desperate," Chayton said, his voice a low, angry rumble. "Their stolen money is running out, so they take what they can. They are leaving a trail of bodies now." The new killings lit a fresh fire in him. His pursuit became more relentless, his pace more urgent. He pushed his horse, and by extension, Elspeth, to the limits of their endurance. Elspeth, her arm now beginning to heal, did not protest. The sight of the murdered couple, so similar to the fate that had almost been her own, had hardened her resolve. This was no longer just about her own survival or justice. It was about stopping these men before they could destroy any more innocent lives. It was 2 days later that they encountered a new and unexpected complication. Chayton, scouting ahead, returned to their small, hidden camp with a grim look on his face. "There are others on the trail," he said. "A dozen riders. From the east. A sheriff's posse." Elspeth's heart leaped with a sudden, surprised hope. "The law. They can help us. We have to find them, tell them what we know." Chayton's expression did not soften. He shook his head. "You do not understand. They are white men. They see me. They will see a Dakota warrior, and they will see the dead bodies at the way station. They will not ask questions. They will shoot." He paused, his dark eyes meeting hers. "And they are fools. They ride with the noise of a rock slide. They will blunder into Silas's camp and get themselves slaughtered. They are not hunters. They are cattle, walking towards the wolf's den." His words were a cold dose of reality. She was still thinking like an Easterner, with a naive faith in the structures of law and order. Out here, she was beginning to understand. The only law was strength, cunning, and the color of your skin. "What do we do?" she asked, the hope draining away, replaced by a new kind of fear. "We avoid them," Chayton said. "We let them pass. We will use their noise to cover our own." For the next day, they played a tense game of cat and mouse. They shadowed the posse, keeping to the high ground, staying downwind. Elspeth could see them in the distance, a disorganized, bickering group of men who looked more like armed farmers than experienced lawmen. Their leader, a portly man with a shiny badge and a loud voice, seemed to be constantly arguing with his men. Chayton's assessment had been brutally accurate. That evening, a tense and defining moment arrived. Chayton had made their camp in a deep, wooded ravine. He had just returned from a quick hunt, two rabbits slung over his shoulder, when they heard the sound of approaching horses. It was a small patrol, two men from the posse, who had evidently strayed from their main group. "Stay here," Chayton hissed, his hand closing on the stock of his Winchester. "Do not make a sound." He melted back into the shadows of the pines, a ghost in the deepening twilight. The two riders came closer, their voices loud and careless. They were complaining about the sheriff, the heat, the futility of their chase. They were close enough now that Elspeth could see their faces. They stopped their horses not 30 yards from her hiding place. One of them spotted the faint wisp of smoke from their carefully shielded fire. "Hey, what's that?" he called out, drawing his pistol. This was it. The moment Chayton had warned her about. They would be discovered, and the discovery would be violent. Elspeth's mind raced. Chayton could likely kill both of them before they even knew what was happening. But that would make him a murderer in the eyes of the law. It would turn their hunt for justice into a flight from it. She had to do something. She made a decision. It was a gamble, a dangerous, desperate play. Ignoring Chayton's order, she stepped out from behind the rocks, her good hand raised in a gesture of surrender. "Hello," she called out, her voice clear and strong, the educated, cultured tones of a Philadelphia lady ringing out in the wilderness. "Please, don't shoot. I'm in desperate need of help." The two men stared at her, their jaws slack with astonishment. A white woman, here, alone, dressed in a strange mixture of a torn, tattered dress and what looked like Indian leatherwork. It was the last thing they had expected to find. "Ma'am," one of them stammered, lowering his pistol. "What in the world?" "I was attacked," she said, letting a calculated tremor enter her voice, playing the part of the damsel in distress she so despised. "My wagon bandits, they left me for dead." As she spoke, Chayton materialized from the shadows behind her. He did not have his rifle. He stood with his arms crossed, a silent, intimidating presence. The two posse members' eyes went wide with fear. Their hands instinctively went for their guns. "Wait," Elspeth commanded, stepping in front of Chayton, shielding him with her own body. "This man saved my life. He is a scout. He found me. He has been helping me." The men hesitated, their minds struggling to process the scene. A lone white woman, defending an armed Indian. It went against everything they knew, every prejudice they held. "He is tracking the same men you are," Elspeth pressed, her voice gaining a new authority. "The men who killed the station master. He knows their trail. He knows their ways. You need him. Your sheriff needs him. If you want to find these killers, he is your only chance." She had turned the tables. She had used their prejudice, and their surprise, against them. She had transformed Chayton from a potential target into an indispensable asset. She had used her identity, her whiteness, her perceived helplessness, as a weapon and a shield. The two men exchanged a long, uncertain look. They were out of their depth. This situation was not covered in any manual for amateur lawmen. "You'd better come with us," one of them finally said, his voice filled with a reluctant, bewildered respect. "The sheriff is gonna want to hear this." As they prepared to ride to the posse's main camp, Chayton looked at her. There was a new light in his eyes. He had seen her use a different kind of strength, a different kind of weapon. He fought with the knife and the rifle. She fought with words and wits. And he was beginning to understand that her way could be just as deadly, and just as effective, as his own. The posse's camp was a study in disorganized chaos. It was spread out along a creek bed, with half a dozen small, smoky fires burning, a clear violation of every rule of stealth Chayton held sacred. The men were a motley collection of townsfolk and farmers, their faces a mixture of boredom, anxiety, and misplaced bravado. Their leader, Sheriff Bodini, was a large, red-faced man with a walrus mustache and a deeply ingrained sense of his own importance. The arrival of Elspeth, escorted by the two scouts and trailed by the silent, imposing figure of Chayton, brought the entire camp to a standstill. Sheriff Bodini strode forward, his chest puffed out, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "What in the name of Sam Hill is this?" he boomed, his eyes narrowing with suspicion as he took in Chayton. Elspeth, exhausted but resolute, took charge. She told her story again, her voice clear and steady, leaving out no detail of the attack, the crash, or her rescue. She presented herself not as a victim, but as a key witness, a survivor with crucial information. And this man, she concluded, gesturing to Chayden, is the reason I am alive. He is also the reason you have a chance of catching these men. He has been on their trail for days. He knows where they are going. Bodini looked from Elspeth to Chayden, his expression a mixture of disbelief and deep-seated prejudice. The idea of taking orders, or even advice, from an Indian was clearly offensive to his sense of natural order. I don't need any help from a redskin scout, he blustered. I've got this well in hand. Do you? Elspeth countered, her voice sharp, all traces of the helpless damsel gone. You've been on their trail for 3 days, and you are further behind them now than when you started. Your men make enough noise to be heard in the next territory. The only thing you are hunting successfully is your own tails. Silas Croft and his men are professional killers. You are amateurs. Without him, she said, her voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper, you are riding to your own funerals. Her words, delivered with such authority and contempt, stunned the sheriff into silence. His men, who had been listening with rapt attention, began to murmur amongst themselves. They knew she was right. They were out of their depth, and they were scared. Chayden, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. Their trail leads north, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. Towards the broken lands near Bear Butte. They are looking for a place to hide, to count their stolen money. They will make a mistake. They are getting arrogant. He looked directly at Bodini. You will never find them. Not without me. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. Sheriff Bodini was trapped. To refuse Chayden's help now, in front of his own men, after Elspeth's scathing assessment, would be to admit his own incompetence. To accept would be to swallow his pride. He chose the lesser of two evils. All right, he grumbled, his face a mottled red. He can ride with us. But he answers to me. Understand? Chayden simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. He did not need to be in charge. He only needed to be there when the time came to deliver his own form of justice. And so, an uneasy alliance was formed. The clumsy, noisy posse was now being guided by the silent, expert tracker. Chayden rode at the head of the column with Sheriff Bodini, a study in contrasts. Bodini would shout orders and point in vague, incorrect directions, while Chayden would subtly guide them with a quiet word, a small gesture, correcting their course without openly challenging the sheriff's fragile authority. Elspeth was given a horse and rode beside them. She became the unlikely bridge between the two men, translating Chayden's quiet observations into language the sheriff could understand. She explained why they needed to douse their fires at night, why they needed to post silent sentries, why they needed to conserve their water. Slowly, grudgingly, the posse began to transform from a bumbling mob into something resembling a disciplined tracking party. The journey was a tense one. Many of the posse members still looked at Chayden with suspicion and mistrust. But they could not deny his skill. They saw how he could read a story in a single broken twig, how he could find fresh water where they saw only dry rock. Respect, slow and reluctant, began to grow. Elspeth found herself in a new role. She was no longer a victim or a burden. She was a crucial part of the hunt. Her sharp eyes and keen memory for detail were invaluable. She worked with Chayden to create a detailed description of each of the bandits, which was then circulated among the posse. One evening, as they made a cold, smokeless camp, Chayden came to sit beside her. You were right, he said, his voice a low murmur in the darkness. Your weapons, they are strong. And you were right, she replied, looking at the now disciplined camp around them. They were fools, but perhaps they can learn. A rare, fleeting smile touched his lips. Perhaps. They were getting closer. The trail was growing warmer. The tracks were fresher. The sense that a final, violent confrontation was imminent grew with every mile they traveled. The uneasy alliance was holding, a fragile truce between two worlds, united by a common purpose. And they were all riding together, into the shadow of Bear Butte, where Silas Croft and his men were waiting, blissfully unaware that their pursuers were no longer just a posse of fools, but a force now guided by the keen, vengeful eyes of the falcon. Bear Butte rose from the plains like a great, slumbering animal, its slopes dark with pine and cedar, its summit a jagged crown of rock against the endless sky. To Chayden's people, it was a sacred place, a place of visions and power, called Matopata. To Silas Croft and his gang, it was simply a perfect, defensible fortress. Chayton led the posse to a hidden basin a few miles from the base of the butte. From here, they could observe without being seen. He and Elspeth crept forward to a high ridge that overlooked the Outlaws' suspected lair, a series of caves and rock shelters on the eastern slope, a place known to outlaws and renegades as the Vulture's Roost. Through his spyglass, Chayton confirmed his suspicions. He could see them. Silas and his men. There were 4 of them, the ones who had attacked the way station. They were relaxed, confident in their isolation. Horses were grazing in a small, hidden meadow, and a thin wisp of smoke curled up from one of the cave mouths. "They are all there," Chayton whispered, passing the spyglass to Elspeth. She looked, her hand steady. She saw them, the men who had destroyed her life, who had murdered Finn, who had left her for dead. A cold, hard knot of anger tightened in her chest. She saw Silas, his back to them, laughing with one of his men. The sight of him, so casual and carefree, was a profound offense. "That's them," she confirmed, her voice a low, tight whisper. "That's all of them." They returned to the posse's camp, and a council of war was held. Sheriff Bodini, his confidence now fully restored by the fact that they had actually found their quarry, was all for a direct, frontal assault. "We'll ride in at dawn," he declared, stabbing a finger at a crudely drawn map. "Hit 'em hard and fast. Overwhelm them before they know what's happened." Chayton shook his head, his expression grim. "That is suicide. The approach is a narrow, rocky trail. They hold the high ground. They will pick you off one by one before you get halfway up the slope. You would be attacking a fortress." "So what do you suggest, Scout?" Bodini sneered, his old arrogance returning. "We just sit here and wait for them to ride away." "I suggest," Chayton said, his voice cutting through the sheriff's bluster, "that we use the mountain against them. We use our heads, not just our guns." He knelt and began to draw in the dust with a stick, his movements precise and certain. He outlined the butte, the location of the caves, the single trail leading up to them. Then he began to add other lines, other trails. "There's another way," he explained. "A goat path. Here, on the north face. It is steep, dangerous, but it will lead to the ridge above their camp. A small group, moving at night, could get into position without ever being seen." His plan was simple, elegant, and deadly. He and a few of the best men would take the goat path during the night. The main posse, under Bodin's command, would create a diversion at the mouth of the main trail just before dawn, making a great deal of noise, drawing the outlaws' attention. While the bandits were focused on the frontal assault that wasn't coming, Chayton's group would be in position above and behind them, cutting off their escape and trapping them in a crossfire. Sheriff Bodini listened, his face a mask of grudging admiration. The plan was brilliant. It was also a plan that relegated him and the bulk of his posse to a secondary, supporting role, while the Indian scout took the lead in the real fight. His pride warred with his common sense. This time, common sense, bolstered by the grim, approving faces of his own men, won out. "All right," he finally agreed. "We'll do it your way." As night fell, a deep, moonless dark that swallowed the landscape, Chayton chose his team. He picked 2 of the posse's younger, leaner men who looked like they had some experience in the mountains. He looked at Elspeth. "You will stay here," he said. It was not a question. "No," she replied, her voice firm. "I'm going with you." "It is too dangerous," he insisted. "This is no place for a woman." "I am the only one who can positively identify every single one of them," she argued, her chin held high. "In the dark, in the confusion, you might let one slip away. I will not." "And," she added, her voice dropping, "I am not the same woman you found by the river, Chayton. You taught me how to be quiet. You taught me how to see. I will not be a liability. I need to see this through. For Finn, for my father, for myself." He looked at her for a long, searching moment. He saw the iron resolve in her eyes, the strength that had been forged in the crucible of their journey. She was right. She had earned this. "All right," he said with a single, slow nod. "But you will do exactly as I say." The small group of 4 set out into the darkness. The climb up the goat path was a treacherous, heart-stopping ordeal. It was barely their trail of loose rock and scree that clung to a near-vertical cliff face. They moved in a profound silence, communicating only by hand signals, their movements slow and agonizingly precise. Elspeth, her arm now mostly healed but still aching, climbed with a grit and determination that surprised the other men. She was fueled by a cold, burning anger. Every handhold, every step, was an act of defiance against the men who had tried to break her. After hours of painstaking, lung-burning effort, they reached the ridge above the Outlaws' camp. They lay flat on the cold stone, peering down. Below them, a single fire burned, a lone outlaw standing a lazy, inattentive watch. The others were presumably asleep in the caves. They were in position. The trap was set. Now, all they had to do was wait for the dawn, and for the signal that would unleash their righteous, long-delayed fury upon the lair of the beast. The darkness before the dawn was the coldest, deep, inky blackness that seemed to suck the warmth from the very stones. Elspeth lay on the ridge, a borrowed rifle clutched in her hands, its cold steel a stark reality. She felt no fear, only a strange, heightened sense of clarity. Every sound whisper of the wind through the pines, the distant cry of a night bird was amplified, every shadow held a deep and profound meaning. She was no longer an observer. She was a hunter. Down below, the outlaws' fire had burned down to a dull, red glow. The lone sentry was dozing, his head slumped against his chest. Chayton lay beside her, as still and as silent as the rock he was pressed against. He was watching the eastern horizon, waiting for the first, faint hint of gray light. He had given them their instructions in a series of low whispers. They would not fire until he did. Their targets were assigned. Their purpose was clear. Finally, it came. A distant sound, from the direction of the main trail. It was the sound of Sheriff Bodine's posse, a clumsy, deliberate crashing through the underbrush, a man's voice raised in a shouted, mock command. The diversion. The effect on the camp below was instantaneous. The dozing sentry jolted awake. He kicked the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the air, and shouted into the mouth of the nearest cave. Riders come in. The outlaws stumbled out of their caves, blurry-eyed and cursing, grabbing their rifles and pistols. Silas Croft was the last to emerge, his movements sharp and alert, his mind already assessing the threat. To the rocks, he commanded, pointing towards a natural breastwork of boulders that overlooked the main trail. It's that fool sheriff. Let's give him a welcome he won't forget. They scrambled into position, their backs to the ridge, their attention completely focused on the noisy, obvious threat below. It was a perfect, textbook error. Chayton rose to a kneeling position. He raised his Winchester, the first, clean light of dawn glinting on its long barrel. He did not aim at the men. He aimed at a large, flat slab of rock just above Silas's head. He fired. The bullet struck the rock with a loud, metallic ping, sending a shower of stone fragments down onto the outlaws. It was not a killing shot. It was an announcement. We are here. Above you. Behind you. You are trapped. The bandits spun around, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. They were caught in the open, exposed, their cover now useless. It's a trap, Silas screamed, his eyes darting up towards the ridge, searching for the source of the shot. But it was too late. The rifles from the ridge opened up in a devastating, coordinated volley. One of the outlaws, the hulking brute who had grabbed Elspeth at her wagon, was thrown backward, his chest a ruin. Another screamed and clutched his leg, tumbling down into the open. Elspeth fired, her movement steady, the recoil of the rifle a solid, reassuring punch against her good shoulder. She did not aim at a man. She aimed at the ground in front of them, kicking up dust, adding to the chaos, pinning them down. The outlaws, their discipline shattered, began to fire wildly up at the ridge, their bullets whining harmlessly over the attackers' heads. From below, Sheriff Bodini and his posse, hearing the eruption of gunfire from above, now began their real charge up the main trail, their own rifles blazing. The outlaws were caught in a perfect, inescapable crossfire. The battle was a short, brutal, and utterly one-sided affair. Two more of the bandits went down under the relentless, accurate fire from the ridge. Silas Croft, realizing the situation was hopeless, did not stand and fight. He was a survivor. He made a desperate, scrambling run for the hidden meadow where the horses were kept. It was his only chance for escape. But Chayton was waiting for him. He had anticipated this move. He was no longer on the ridge. He had moved with a silent, impossible speed, circling around to intercept Silas's escape route. Silas burst into the small meadow and saw him. Chayton was standing there, between him and the horses, his Winchester held loosely at his side. He was not aiming it. He simply stood there, a silent, implacable figure of judgment. "It's over, Silas," Chayton said, his voice quiet but carrying with a deadly finality. Silas, his face a contorted mask of rage and desperation, drew his pistol. He was fast, but he had not been a wagon master. He had been a thief who had murdered his way across the territory. His final act was one of a killer. Chayton was faster. He did not fire his rifle. He dropped it, and in the same fluid motion, the long-bladed knife, his grandfather's knife, was in his hand. He moved not like a man, but like a force of nature, a striking falcon. He met Silas's charge, deflecting the man's gun hand, the pistol firing harmlessly into the sky. The two men closed in a brief, brutal, and final struggle. It ended with Chayton standing, his face grim, and Silas Croft lying on the ground. His reign of terror ended, the skinning knife he had used on Finn now lying beside him in the dust. The Falcon's judgment had been delivered. Justice, for Dubois, for Finn, for all the others, was done. The aftermath of the gunfight was quiet and somber. Sheriff Bodini and his posse, their faces a mixture of awe and relief, rounded up the single surviving, wounded outlaw. They collected the bodies of the dead with a grim efficiency. The vulture's roost was cleansed. Elspeth walked through the outlaw's main cave, a place of filth and stolen goods. In a corner, she found it. Her strongbox, broken open, the money gone. But beside it, tossed aside as worthless, were her father's scientific instruments and her leather satchel of artist's supplies. She knelt and gathered them, her touch gentle, reverent. She had gotten a piece of her old life back. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she could never fully return to it. She found Chayton by the small meadow, cleaning his grandfather's knife. He looked up as she approached, his face unreadable. "It is finished," he said. "Yes," she replied, her voice quiet. "It is." They stood in a comfortable silence for a long moment, the shared experience of the past weeks a powerful and spoken bond between them. The sounds of the posse preparing to leave its jingle of harnesses, the gruff commands of the sheriff seemed to come from another world. Sheriff Bodini strode up to them, his hat in his hands, his face stripped of all its former bluster. He looked at Chayton with a new, profound respect. "Will you?" he said, his voice rough with an unaccustomed humility. "We all do. I was wrong about you." He offered his hand. Chayton looked at it for a moment, then took it, a firm, brief shake that sealed an unlikely peace. "Miss Vance," the sheriff continued, turning to her, "we'll escort you to Fort Laramie. You'll be safe with us." This was it. The crossroads. The end of the trail. The path back to the world she had known, the world of safety, of civilization, of polite society. It was everything she had been struggling to get back to. And yet, the thought of it left her feeling empty. She looked at Chayton. He stood a little apart, his gaze fixed on the vast, open prairie that stretched out below them. He was a man of the wilderness, a part of this land. To leave him now felt like leaving a piece of her own soul behind. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But I don't think that's my path any longer." She turned to Chayton. "You said you were a man caught between two worlds. I think perhaps I am too." He turned to look at her, a question in his dark eyes. "My work isn't finished," she explained, a new, powerful sense of purpose filling her. "The Black Hills are still waiting. I still have a journal to fill." She took a deep breath. "But I cannot do it alone. I need a guide, a protector, a partner." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. It was a question about more than just a job. It was a question about a future that was unwritten, a trail that they would have to blaze for themselves. A slow, rare smile spread across Chayton's face. It was a smile that reached his eyes, chasing away some of the ancient sadness that lived there. "The plants of the Pahasapa have many stories to tell," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It is good that they will have someone to write them down." It was all the answer she needed. And so, when the posse rode out, leading their single prisoner and their grim cargo, Elspeth and Chayton did not go with them. They stood on the slope of the sacred mountain and watched them go, two solitary figures against the vast, empty canvas of the West. She was no longer just a botanist from the East. He was no longer just a scout haunted by his past. They were survivors. They were partners. They had been brought together by violence and loss, but they had forged a bond of respect and affection in the heart of the wilderness. They turned and looked towards the distant, hazy line of the Cheyenne River, the place where their two desperate trails had first converged. The river had been the edge of her dream, the place where her old life had ended. Now, she realized, it was also the beginning. A promise of a new life, a new journey, a new horizon, waiting to be discovered, together.